Hey everyone, Clio here, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about my big book TBR. So I'm going to be doing multiple videos within this series. So I'm going to be talking about my big book TBR, my fantasy TBR, my classics TBR, and then I'm also going to be talking about all of the books on my TBR. So the final day of 2020, I'm going to go over every single book that's still on my TBR at that point in time. So in this video, I'll possibly show you some books that might not be on my physical TBR anymore by the end of this month. Those I will put at the end of this video, so hopefully I'll still get around to it within this year. So, Big Book TBR, it's simple. These are all of the books over 500 pages that are still on my physical shelves that I still want to get around to, that I have not unhauled throughout the unhaul process. So at some point in time, I still want to get around to all of these. I know big books are typically considered to be quite daunting, but I actually don't really have a problem reading big books. In 2020 itself, I didn't actually read all that many big books, but that is actually quite exceptional because usually my amount of books is a lot lower, but the average page count is a lot higher. So this year I actually read a lot more shorter books than I typically do. But so without further ado, let's just dive into it and let me go through all of these books. I'm not going to go into too much with these books, of course, because yeah, it is just an overview of what is still on my physical TBR. First one, Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch, which is the first book in the Gentleman Besson series. So this is a fantasy series with a sort of heist plot, piratey plot as well, I think, and it has great friendship apparently. It's the first one in the series. This is scheduled for 2021. If you've seen my reading goals for 2021 video, then you will know that this is scheduled, it's happening. Next up, another fantasy, which is also a recurring theme within this video, and that will be Master of Stars by Justin Call. As far as I'm aware, we're kind of following the anti-hero in this one. We have this sort of character who is studying to become a great magician, but he's kind of destined to become the bad guy, I think. A general fiction one, and that would be Beijing Coma by Mai Tian. Don't know too much about this anymore. I got this for Christmas at some point. I requested this for Christmas, but so at this point in time I really don't know too much anymore. It seems to be set around Cultural Revolution time. So I used to study Chinese. I did 1 year of Chinese at university, and so I do want to read more Chinese works because it is a culture that I'm very much fascinated with. So I got this book at that point in time and I still have to read it. Next up we have a classic, and that would be The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne. So this is a French classic. It's kind of sci-fi genre, let's consider it like that. I have read a couple of Jules Verne and I really enjoyed them. And it's very interesting reading his work at this point in time because there are definitely certain elements to his stories that have come true, that have been predicted by him at this point in time. Next up we have a Michael Crichton, which is State of Fear. So I very much like Michael Crichton. He is the author of Jurassic Park, and so Jurassic Park is one of my favorite movies. I absolutely loved reading that book, and so I have been reading more Michael Crichton throughout the years, and it is kind of hit or miss. You know, some of his works I find very good and others I just find mediocre, but they are always entertaining. I think the least fun I had was with Andromeda Strain, just because it was a little bit too, you know, it was a little bit too textbook style rather than really having a sort of like engaging narrative style to it. But so in State of Fear, I don't know too much about it, but it's basically some mysterious events taking place around the world that will somehow be connected throughout this book. Next we have a non-fiction, which typically I don't really count them, but so this year I put them on my TBR, so maybe they'll just disappear off of my TBR at some point, but then when will I ever get to read them? So maybe I should keep them on there. And so that is Cleopatra by Alberto Angela. So this is a non-fiction about Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. So I very much love Egypt. When I was 10 years old, we went to Egypt, and I've been fascinated by the culture ever since, probably already before that, but then mainly, you know, the ancient Egypt, though I just don't know enough about modern Egypt. But so I do want to dive into a little bit more non-fiction about Egypt as well, because especially with the character of Cleopatra, I really only know what was said about her in like typical representations and things like that. I know a little bit about the mythology of Egypt and things like that, but about, you know, the actual history, there really isn't much depth to my knowledge on that subject, so I do want to dive into Cleopatra a little bit more. Next up we have two that go together and that I'm hoping to read in the months of January and February, and that would be Don Quixote. Don Quixote is a Spanish classic, and it is a chunker. Together these form 1,500 pages of an epic story about this guy called Don Quixote who reads too many romance novels, it's called, but it's just like too much general fiction, let's consider it like that. And based off of those, he starts to imagine himself as being this grand knight who needs to go on this quest to win the love of his love interest Dulcinea. But in reality, he is just imagining things all around. He goes into this epic fight with what he believes to be giants, but in reality they are just windmills, for example. Don't know how we're filling 1,500 pages with that and still keeping it entertaining, but we'll see. I do want to dive into this one, and so Kate from Kate Fields' channel, she is doing a read-along for this over the months December, January and February for her Patreon page, and so I won't be reading it in December because I have too much on there, but I'm going to try to fit in these chunkers in January and February. Next up we have another two that belong together, and that is book 1 and 3 in the Trader Spy trilogy by Trudy Canavan. Book 2 just falls short of the 500 page mark. But so this is a sequel trilogy to the Black Magician trilogy, in which we were following Sonia, who's a street urchin who then finds out that she actually has magical powers, and in this world it's normally just reserved for the nobility. And so it's going to be looking at class differences and things like that, and the way in which she has to deal with bullying at school, for example, in the earlier books. And throughout the books we will also explore sort of like bigger world conflict as well. Very much looking forward to diving into this one, and it is also scheduled for 2021. So next up we have The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. This is one of the 2 Dickens that I still have left on my shelves. I have a goal of finishing all of Charles Dickens' works. I will say that I don't know what this one is about. I'm guessing an old curiosity shop, but so it is basically there because I am gathering more Charles Dickens in order to be able to read all of them. And so I might as well at that same point in time reference The Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens, which is the other Dickens that I still have on my shelves, which is also a huge chunker, even bigger than The Old Curiosity Shop. Next up, another fantasy series, and that will be The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. First book in the Licanius trilogy, I think it's called. Does it say that here? Yeah, Licanius trilogy. So don't know too much about this one, but it came heavily recommended from a booktuber that I was following, and so I really wanted to get this one and to try it out. I think it is a popular opinion to diss on this series, but I have heard that it is definitely a solid one. It's not like going to make it into your top 10 if you read a whole lot of fantasy perhaps, but it's definitely a solid entry apparently. So I do want to still pick it up because I have it, and you know, I like reading fantasy, so there's no reason for me to get rid of it just because it might not be, you know, my new favorite fantasy series of all time. You know, not every single read needs to become your new absolute standout. A solid one is definitely also welcome. Next up, a book that I will say I don't remember anything about what the premise is, but I am still intrigued to try it out, and that would be Captain Corelli's Mandolin by Louis de Bernières. So Louis de Bernières is a very well-known author, but I think he writes kind of like impactful historical fiction perhaps. And so my mother actually absolutely loved Captain Corelli's Mandolin and loved the movie adaptation, or just the story in general. I think it has to do with this sort of love story centered around a sort of war. Yeah, it seems to be about a Italian officer who lands on this sort of Greek island and who's kind of ostracized by the society within, but there's going to be a love story. Next up we have Strange a Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I will say that my interest in this has kind of waned a little bit. I kind of bought this in 2020. I wanted to try some of these sort of like booktube babies, some of these series that a lot of people on booktube talk about. And so this is fantasy, it's whimsical fantasy, but I think it's YA fantasy, and I don't really love YA fantasy. I was kind of trying to get back into it, but you know, the biggest attempt that I made is in 2020 was Six of Crows, which was a letdown. Not in the sense that I absolutely hated Six of Crows, but I was just so disappointed with the fact that people really refer to it as like their favorite series of all time. And I'm not dissing on those people or anything like that, but for me it really was just like average. That was my experience with it. Average, verging towards disappointing, verging towards, you know, predictable. And so that has made me hesitant to dive into Strange the Dreamer. As far as I'm aware, it's about this sort of like lost city of Weep, and we're going to have this person who has been studying this place for years finally being able to visit this world. Don't know too much more about it, know that it's extremely whimsical, which is a hit or miss with me. I do like magical realism, which has whimsy to it in essence, but like I don't like, for example, Neil Gaiman, which I would also say is very whimsical in its writing style, so we'll have to see. Next up, another general fiction one, and another one that I actually don't really remember too much about, which is The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen, which is a US-based book, I think, and I think it's mainly looking at family dynamics, but I could be totally wrong about that. Interesting. So it is saying it's about a troubled family living in a troubled age. Alfred is slowly losing his mind to Parkinson's disease as his condition worsens, and the Lamberts are forced to face the secrets and failures that haunt them. Enid sets her heart on gathering everyone together for one last family Christmas. So family saga combined with the difficulties of facing a worsening condition like Parkinson's. So I am intrigued now. Though I will say, like, I don't have a problem with big books in general, but big general fiction can be something else, because general fiction I think works quite well with shorter formats. Longer formats can really feel a little bit like it drags, and then oftentimes I will feel like it's too long for its subject matter, so we'll have to see. Next up, another fantasy one, and that would be The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, first book in his First Law trilogy, grimdark fantasy that is heavily focused on the character, apparently. Don't know anything more about this. This is, I think, on my 12 books for 2021 list, so it does get rewarded more heavily if I manage to finish this one, so who knows? Maybe it'll happen in 2021. So the next book on here is very daunting, not necessarily because of its length, and that would be La Fiancée de l'Hiver by Christelle Davos. In English, this is A Winter's Promise, first book in the, don't know what it's called in English, trilogy. No, not even a trilogy, it's a series. Third book of this series just came out in English, I think. But there are 4 parts to this series, and I have it in French. It's an originally French fantasy novel that for some reason I then decided I wanted to buy in French. I do speak French, but it's like high school level, though like Belgian high school level is a little bit more advanced than other high school levels because it is one of our official languages. Half of the country speaks French, so you know the French education is quite important as well to Belgium. So I would definitely say that I have a decent knowledge of French. I also did take care of the French market for my workplace for a while, but yeah, a full book in French, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens with this one. Don't really know too much about it. I know it has these cities that are on like spheres or things like that, and that the person that we're following has the possibility to learn an object's history by touching it, but that's basically all that I know. And that she enters into an arranged marriage, I think, as well. But so we'll have to discover more as we go along. Then we get to the biggest book on my shelf, and that would be Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. If you add up the 2 Don Quixotes, they are actually bigger, but yeah, I count them separately, so Les Miserables is the biggest one. I do definitely want to read this one, but if I'm tackling Don Quixote, do I also want to tackle Les Miserables? Maybe it'll be a 2022 project. We'll see what ends up happening. But so, this is a French classic in which we are following Jean Valjean, who at the beginning of this book steals a bread, I think, a loaf of bread, and that's why he ends up as a prisoner, and then he escapes at some point and he's persecuted by the French law. But it definitely grows into a much bigger story from that. That's definitely a reflection on, like a criticism on the realities of that time period. I absolutely love this musical. I definitely do want to read the book. I have also read Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo, and I really liked that book as well. I really liked Victor Hugo's writing style, so I do want to try it out, but it is just ginormous, so I don't necessarily always have the time to invest in it. Like War and Peace, for example, I did read it like last year, I think, but that was kind of my project for the month, and you know, I spent that entire month almost on that book, so I do definitely need to take my time with these big classics. So that is basically it, but we also do have 2 books that are on my December TBR that should be gone from this list, though I do think that one of these is going to probably stay. So the one that I think that will still be on this TBR at the end of the month is Congo by David van Rijbroek. This is another non-fiction about Congo. So I am from Belgium. We used to colonize the Congo, and so I do want to dive more into that history because while I already learned a little bit about this period in time in school, it is something that is generally just like shrugged under the rug. Nobody really talks about it here in Belgium, and we definitely have a lot of information about the time period that is never discussed or never shown to the public, for example. And so I do definitely want to explore more of that period and of what actually took place in colonial times in Congo. And definitely I do also want to look more at modern times as well, because I'm going to assume that this book is also going to go into present day repercussion or the way in which the decolonization affected the region or things like that. So I do definitely want to read it, but December is really not shaping up to be a great reading month, so I don't know whether I'll be able to. What I am definitely going to try and get around to, so if this is on my TBR in 2021, I have definitely failed. That would be The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, another French classic. So this is a revenge story, often referred to as the greatest revenge story of all time. So in this one we are following our protagonist called Dantes. Dantes at the beginning of this book is a sort of like promising sailor who is just been promised to be promoted to be captain. And so he has a couple of people in his environment who are very jealous of him, not necessarily just for that success, but there's also, for example, a rival for the love of a certain girl who is in love with Dantes. And so these sort of three characters team up together to conspire against Dantes and to land him into prison. So later on he escapes prison and he sets up this huge revenge plot that we will be exploring throughout. I am about halfway through at this point in time. I do want to finish it this month. But yeah, that might come at the cost of other reading within this month. But so that's the entirety of the Big Book TBR. I definitely don't think that all of these books will have disappeared from this list by 2021. I'm not necessarily super daunted by big books, nor am I like putting like 5 of these into every single month, because I know I won't be able to read 5 big books in 1 month, or maybe, but like probably not. So I do definitely expect that half of this list at the very least is still going to be there in 2021. But there are definitely a couple of books that I mentioned here that have already been scheduled for 2021 or that I'm definitely very eager to dive into shortly. So let me know if you have seen any book on this list that you want me to prioritize. Definitely make a case for it. Tell me why I should push it forward on my list. And if there's one that you're kind of like, maybe if you haven't finished it by the end of 2021, maybe consider letting it go because of a bad experience that you might have had with it. But so yeah guys, I hope you enjoyed this one. As I said, there are more videos out within this series, so definitely do check them out or do be on the lookout for them. Not entirely sure in which order I'm going to be publishing them, so yeah, definitely have that information in the description down below. But yeah, see you guys for the next one. Bye!